But when I went into the cabinet office, as I mentioned, soon after 9/11, the first people I thought of was the Israelis, because they had obviously been fighting Islamic terrorism for many, many years. And this was an army that is, in any case, and an intelligence organisation that is, in any case, deeply admired by the British forces and by British intelligence services. And in my career, we studied the IDF from a very early age. When I was at Sandhurst as an officer cadet, we studied the IDF. We studied what they're doing with armoured warfare. And we admired them greatly. We probably studied them above all other contemporary armies because of their experience and their professionalism. And the same went for the intelligence services. So really it was a natural thing to do, in my view, to turn to the Israelis. It wasn't an easy thing to do because there is a natural inbuilt bias by the Foreign Office against Israel and in favour of Arab states. And so it was quite a battle for me to establish a proper liaison partnership between my office and Mossad. But because of Foreign Office opposition, but I achieved that. And we established some very effective liaison, and it was extremely helpful then, and it's been extremely helpful since.
Since then, I think it's really, you came to public prominence, particularly when it comes to Israel and the Jewish community, with that very famous speech you made at the UN in Geneva, particularly after Israel's military operations against Hamas in Gaza in 2008 and then in January 2009. Why did you decide to speak up on behalf of the Israeli Defense Force in their military operation against the Islamist terrorist organisation Hamas in Gaza?
Well, I don't think I had any choice other than to speak up, and I think any right-thinking person who is not prepared to simply see an injustice done would have done exactly what I did. I was in a unique position to be able to do that because I had been involved. I'd studied the Israel Defense Force over many years. I'd seen them in action. I knew a number of senior members of the IDF and junior members. I'd had significant dealings with Israeli intelligence services. So I had the knowledge and with 30 years military experience, including the kind of combat they were fighting, I had the objective view that I could put and that I could introduce into a very confused situation. Plus, I had a media platform because I was already commenting on the BBC and Sky and other stations to do with Afghanistan and Iraq. So I was in a way a unique position to do so. And knowing what I knew, I couldn't hold back. And if I'd seen British soldiers or American soldiers, who are also our very close allies, called war criminals by people on the media, in government, in the United Nations, in the EU, who absolutely had no proper knowledge of it and were simply using it to hit Israel over the head and to demonise the Jewish state, I couldn't sit back and watch. I didn't sit back and watch, and I wouldn't sit back and watch. Israel is a very close friend and ally of the United Kingdom, and in my time that we spoke about a moment ago in the Cabinet Office, I'll give you one example of my interactions with the Israeli government, and that was, I was sent out to Afghanistan in 2003 while I was working in the Cabinet Office, and I asked the head of the Mossad, who I was dealing with on a regular basis in London, if he could get me some expertise from the embassy on how to deal with suicide bomb attacks, because I hadn't dealt with suicide bomb attacks up to that point. And he did one better. He didn't just get the defence attaché from the embassy. He sent to Israel and got a brigadier general who was commanding a division on the Golan Heights, who was deemed to be Israel's #1 expert on countering suicide bomb attacks. He brought him to London. He and I sat in a hotel room in West London with him talking and me writing down for about 3 hours, and I turned that into the British Army's policy for dealing with suicide bomb attacks, and that has saved many, many British soldiers' lives, and our allies, American and other NATO allies. Now, the Israelis didn't need to do that. They did not need to do that. They could have given me any person who knew a bit about it, but they sent their best. And that's just one example of many examples I could give you of close cooperation that I enjoyed and that Britain and Israel enjoy to this day. And British military lives and civilian lives have been saved by Israeli assistance, by Israeli technology, by Israeli intelligence. And I include in that, undoubtedly, some of the victims of the Manchester bombing, who I'm certain will have their lives saved, those who weren't killed, who were seriously injured, or have their lives repaired as a result of Israeli medical technology.
Richard, that's absolutely incredible, but why don't we hear about that? Why don't we hear enough of that from the British government to talk about the incredible efforts that the Israeli military defence establishment have contributed to Britain's fight against Islamic extremism and terrorism and military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I was quite gratified to hear when David Cameron addressed the Knesset in what was one of, I think, the best speeches made to the Knesset by a foreign leader in many years. And he did mention it, but he mentioned it very, very small way and in passing. And the reality is that our leaders and our politicians are controlled by the Foreign Office to some extent when they're talking about Israel or other foreign affairs. And it comes back to the Foreign Office anti-Israel bias. They don't want it to be known. They would rather it was kept under wraps. They'd rather it was kept secret. But I can tell you now, I've spoken to British soldiers who are in a very, very bad way in a hospital bed after having had their legs blown off, and they're still alive, albeit in a terribly bad way, because of Israeli battlefield medical technology, and they know it. They're not told it officially, but they know it because these things get known within the British Army. And they know it and are grateful for it, and their families are grateful for it, and the country should be grateful for it. And it's also little known that very soon after the Manchester bombing, I mean, I mentioned the medical technology that would have been used. Also, I'm no doubt at all that Israel would have swung a significant intelligence effort behind trying to identify what had gone on there to help our intelligence services. But also, they sent within a day or so, they sent a psychiatric team to Manchester and set up a base where they could train British psychologists and psychiatrists in treating this kind of trauma. Without being asked, they just did it. And that's the sort of, you know, you name any disaster in the world, you'll find Israel among the first responders to that disaster. And often, some of these broadcasters, some of the politicians, some people in the media try and sweep that under the rug for the same reasons as I mentioned before.
And Richard, you were there for Israel's military operation against Hamas in 2014, in which Israel was then the centre of media attention, in which Israel was claimed that she was using disproportionate use of force in sending ground troops in to confront Hamas. When are the British public and when are responsible media outlets going to come to understand that we face a new theatre of war, and that's the issue of asymmetrical warfare, in which terrorists like Hamas and Hezbollah, Islamic State, do not adhere to the Geneva Convention, who fire their weapons and rockets from schools and hospitals, use women and children as human shields, and yet Israel has to confront this when they're dealing with the likes of Hamas, who pose a direct national security threat to the State of Israel, are in paralysing two-thirds of the State of Israel with their rockets and missiles, as well as building terror tunnels to kidnap hundreds of Israelis and hold them ransom.
Well, I would say absolutely categorically that there are some people that say Israel was very heavy-handed, and unfortunately there's too many prominent people saying that in that conflict. I was out there, as you mentioned, at the time, throughout the conflict, and I watched what was going on, spoke to the people involved, observed actions. And they weren't. Simple as that, they were not heavy-handed. They dealt with it as carefully as they could deal with it, and the measures they took to minimise civilian casualties were far in excess of the measures taken by any other army. And in fact, I was present as a member of a delegation of about 15 retired military officers from around the world, generals from around the world, who went and looked at that campaign afterwards, and they came back. Their greatest concern when they came back was that their own armies, and I'm talking about Germany, Italy, France, US, Holland, Australia, other armies in the West, their own armies would not be able to achieve the standards that Israel had achieved in preserving the lives of civilians on the battlefield. The people that are responsible for every single casualty, whether it's a fighter, whether it's an Israeli, whether it's an Israeli soldier, whether it's an innocent civilian on the Palestinian side, is Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They provoked that war. They started it. What country could possibly accept thousands of missiles being fired into its people and do nothing? When that happened to us in 1943, when the Germans fired rockets into Britain, we hammered everything that could possibly be a rocket site. And the Israelis did not go that far, but they did what they needed to do. And You're right when you talk about asymmetric warfare, and in this particular case I want to focus on just one issue, which is human shields. They're not actually human shields. They don't use human shields. What they do is that they use human sacrifices, because they don't want, their primary goal is not to shield their fighters or shield their weaponry using civilians in the hope that Israel won't fire back because there are civilians there. That's fine, that would work for them, but they don't need to, because they've got plenty of fighters and plenty of weapons. They want Israel to fire back. They want Israel to kill their own civilians. There's never really in history been a people that have wanted their enemies to kill their own civilian population. That is the problem that Israel faces. And I would thoroughly commend the actions Israel took in doing their best to attack and destroy Hamas, while at the same time minimising the death of the people that Hamas wanted them to kill.
I mean, thanks to Israeli technology, we have the Iron Dome, which protected so many Israeli civilians from Hamas's rockets and missiles. If Israel didn't have those missiles to actually protect the incoming rockets from Gaza, what do you think the consequences would have been for Israel during that war?
Well, I think that the most stark consequence of that would be, and this is something that people will not admit to, although it's quite obvious, is that if Israel had received those incoming rockets without being able to defend very effectively against them, and they couldn't defend against every rocket. I was in Ashkelon within literally minutes after a rocket landed on a house and destroyed a house. And there was a young girl in it, about 18, 19 years of age. She just managed to stay alive by going into the rocket room, the shelter room that was in the house, when a siren went off. But this rocket, virtually, it did huge damage to the house, which was actually a doctor's surgery, and as well as a house, which normally at that time of day would have had a bunch of kids in there waiting to be seen by the doctor, who was a paediatrician. I'm no doubt, looking at what happened, that some of those people would have been dead. So these are not fireworks, which some people portray, and some get through. But because Israel was able, through Iron Dome, to prevent such a massive bombardment, they were able to be more careful about the operations they conducted. So that, effectively, Iron Dome not only saved the lives of Israeli civilians, it also saved the lives of Palestinian civilians, because if they hadn't had Iron Dome, they'd have had to hit Gaza much, much harder, with much more civilian casualties, which, by the way, would have been justified, but it's as well they didn't have to.